Hello everyone. In our previous videos we have studied about the formation and the development of male gametophyte and the female gametophyte. Now these two gametes which are formed are non-motile and they require a medium for transportation, and this transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma is called as pollination. In this video we will be studying about pollination. Pollination is the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. There are two types of pollination. One is the self-pollination, the other one is cross-pollination. Coming for self-pollination. Self-pollination is nothing but the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of same flower, or the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of different flower but on the same plant. Now based on this we have two types of self-pollination. One is called as the autogamy, the other one is called as the geitonogamy. In autogamy, the transfer of pollen grains takes place from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Whereas in geitonogamy, the transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on the same plant is called as geitonogamy. The second type of pollination is called as the cross-pollination, which is otherwise called as xenogamy or allogamy. The cross-pollination is nothing but the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther of one flower on one plant to the stigma of another flower of another plant but of the same species is called as the cross-pollination. Now, for the cross-pollination to take place, we require an external agency, that is, to transfer the pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on another plant. We require an external agency. We have two types of external agency. One is called as the abiotic agency, the other one is the biotic agency. The non-living agency is called as the abiotic agency. We have two types of abiotic agency, that is air, the other one is water. If air is the agency for cross-pollination, then we would call it as the anemophily. If water is the agency, we call it as hydrophily. So, air and water plays a very important role as an abiotic agency for transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. Next is the biotic agency. Biotic agency is a living agency which helps in the transfer of the pollen grain from one flower to the stigma of another flower on the another plant. So, if insect play a role in transfer of pollen grain, then it is called as the entomophily. If birds play an important role in cross-pollination, it is called as ornithophily. If bats play an important role, it is called as chiropterophily. If ants play a role, it is called as the myrmecophily. If snails play an important role in cross-pollination, it is called as the malacophily. In general, animals such as monkeys, squirrel play a role in cross-pollination. It is called as zoophily. If this external agency such as abiotic agency and biotic agency is absent, then there is no chance of cross-pollination. Now let's see the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination and cross-pollination. First, let's take up the self-pollination. The main advantage of self-pollination is that this self-pollination do not depend on external agencies such as abiotic agency and biotic agency such as air, water, insects, birds. Since they do not depend upon any external agency, there is 100% assurance of pollination. So, pollination will take place for 100% and the next generation, that is, it gives rise to the next progeny for 100% assurance. Next is the main disadvantage of self-pollination is that since the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower on the same plant takes place, there is the shuffling of gene pool. Within the same gene pool there is shuffling. If this shuffling takes place over and over for a particular period of time, then the nature will select the recessive character, that is, the nature selects the undesirable characteristic. So the plant may give rise to some undesirable triad. Next, let's move on to the cross-pollination. The another important thing of self-pollination here is there is no genetic recombination, hence there is no variation in the organism, and since there is no variation, there is less chance of giving rise to the evolution of new species. Moving on to the cross-pollination, the disadvantage of self-pollination turns to be the advantage of cross-pollination. That is, in self-pollination we have explained that there is no genetic recombination, whereas in cross-pollination, since the transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower of one plant to the stigma of another flower of another plant takes place, there is shuffling of genes. So there is genetic recombination. Since there is genetic recombination, we can see variation. Since there is variation, it gives rise to the evolution of new species. The main disadvantage is the external agency. Without external agency, cross-pollination won't take place, but this turns out to be the disadvantage of cross-pollination, because if there is no external agency, such as insects, birds and bats, the cross-pollination would not take place. That is, there is no 100% assurance of pollination and no 100% assurance to give rise to the next progeny. So, the self-pollinating and the cross-pollinating flowers undergo certain adaptations in order to assure the pollination takes place. So, in our next video, we will study about the adaptation of self-pollinating flower and the cross-pollinating flower. Until then, happy learning from Edge to all.